And welcome to tonight's ICS Faculty Fellowship Lecture about civics and the civil war, the racist origins of the citizenship education industry, presented by Dr. Tim Messer-Kruse. I am Valeria Grimberpla, Professor of Spanish and Director of the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society. Part of the mission of ICS is to engage the BGSU campus and surrounding communities in conversations about important issues in our community and society. This is why our faculty fellowship program features speakers to ask important questions and to help us understand and transform the institutions that structure our lives in places like these camps for thought, right, in the heart of the community. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Bowling Green State University and its campuses are situated in the Great Black Swamp and the Lower Great Lakes region. This land is the homeland of the Wyandot, Kickapoo, Miami, Potawatomi, Ottawa, and multiple other indigenous tribal nations, present and past, who were forcibly removed to and from the area. We recognize these historical and contemporary ties in our efforts towards decolonizing history, and we thank the indigenous individuals and communities who have been living and working on this land from time immemorial. The acknowledgement of land, labor, and systemic racism included here is a way to show respect to indigenous communities, but it is meaningless without action. As you navigate the world around you, we ask you to recognize and address inequitable practices in your organizations and communities. This includes stereotyping, no to little representation for indigenous, Latinx, and Black communities, queer people, and people with disabilities, as well as inequities in education, housing, health, law, and commerce. Accordingly, I also want to recognize the often invisible labor of the people who have prepared this space, who will clean it after we leave, and those who work to maintain it. Big thanks, of course, to Grants for Thought for allowing us to use their space. So if you can, and if you haven't yet, I encourage you, of course, to support their business. I would also like to thank Ahmed Bilal, Alison Sporing, and Mace Kuhale, the ICS graduate assistants who worked very hard to prepare for this event and are here tonight helping us as well. Today it is my honor to introduce one of our Spring 2024 ICS Faculty Fellows, Dr. Tim Messer-Kruse. Tim Messer-Kruse is a professor in the School of Cultural and Critical Studies at Bowling Green State University. His many books have challenged long-established historical interpretations, most famously his award-winning trial of the Haymarket Anarchists, which revisited the 1886 trial of Chicago anarchists and questioned the prevalent assumptions about the trial. His most recent book, Patriot's Dilemma, White Abolitionism and Black Banishment in the Founding of the United States of America, which is forthcoming in April, challenges both conservative and liberal interpretations of the meaning of the American Revolution. Tonight, Dr. Messer-Kruse will share his findings about the history and impact of the notion of civics in American education, showing how these biases persist to these days in what he calls the civic education industry. So, now please join me in welcoming Dr. Tim Messer-Kruse.
Thank you, Laura. And thank you all for coming tonight. It's really such a pleasure to be able to, share ideas with all of you and to see you all here eager to think about new things. It sure beats sitting on a park bench and talking to myself. Although that becomes much easier these days because you can hold your phone, no one looks concerned. So it works out. I found that out. This is an odd sort of a talk for me because I can't think of an occasion in the past when I've given a talk on research that is very much in progress. I've pretty much always completed a research paper or a book and then presented it. This is very much a work in progress, so much so that, in fact, I have a lot to tell you about what I learned yesterday morning. That's how much I'm into it. And I also have to say at the outset just how deeply appreciative I am to the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society for the opportunity to really dig into a subject without the usual academic distractions and responsibilities and duties that come along with being a full-time instructor and teacher and mentor and all the rest that we do at BGSU. So for that opportunity, I'm really, really thankful. It's really been productive for me, and it's really been a great opportunity to embark upon a completely different project, because this is a complete left turn from other things that I've done before, left and directional as opposed to political sort of things. Although I'm not against the left turn, it's just this is not necessarily left. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about the advent of this project, how it's kind of snowballed to where it is, and then I'll dig into what I've found and share that with you. So the first thing is I never thought of myself as ever writing a book about civics. That would have seemed to me about the very last thing I'd ever want to spend my time on. But about 2 years ago, controversy flared up here in Ohio with the Ohio legislature considering new legislation that would have imposed various restrictions and various mandates upon all colleges and universities in Ohio. Known by various titles, but SB 83 it's mostly known by. Among its provisions, and actually one of the least discussed provisions of that law, was a mandate that every university and college require all students to complete a civics class for graduation. And when that proposal was first tucked into the legislation, and I was busy writing editorials and essays against the whole bill, I started thinking, you know, wouldn't it be kind of poetic justice if this thing passes and I write a civics book? That would be really great, because they wouldn't have expected that. I mean, they thought, of course, civics is going to come from Hillsdale or something else. I thought, why not write, you know, a more honest, balanced civics book? And so that's when I started taking notes about civics. And the first question I had about civics was, what is it? Is it clearly defined what civics is? Because actually in this SB 83, it's used the word civics, but then it said civics is history. Well, history is pretty broad, as we all know. And then it said civics is studying the following 5 things: the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, 5 articles of your choice from the Federalist Papers, the Gettysburg Address, and the speech of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the occasion of his incarceration in Birmingham jail. Okay, well, what do all those things, how do they all fit together? What is the civics that they are mandating? And so that was the first part of my research, and I think I came up with a pretty workable, clear definition. Civics is the idea that the teaching of certain political behaviors is a separate, specialized curriculum for schools. And what are those behaviors that we're teaching? It's behaviors like law-abiding behavior, following the law, being a good voter, doing your duties of citizenship, and being somehow engaged in your community in meaningful ways, such as serving on a jury, such as making sure your sidewalk's clean, I suppose. Things like that. Now notice how this is different from other parts of the curriculum we normally think of as being associated with schools. It's not about knowledge, it's about behavior. The touchstone of whether you're a successful civics educator is not really whether someone can pass a test about civics, it's whether or not they then become a dutiful voter and a law-abiding citizen and a good neighbor and possibly a good jurist, and maybe even a public servant. That's the definition of civics. So it has a very odd and specialized relationship to education in general, because most of education is about a body of abstract knowledge which we measure by whether or not you understand this knowledge, not whether you actually do the knowledge. I can take an art history course and pass the course without painting a Picasso, right? I just have to have certain knowledge about this stuff. But with civics, you actually have to do it to be civically minded. So that was my first question. I nailed that down, and then I started digging into, well, where did this begin? Where did this idea come from? What was the first civics book that I can cite in the introduction to my civics book of my own? And I was really surprised to find out that there is a very slight literature on the history of civics. When I say slight, I mean there's one introduction to one collection of essays that deals with the history of civics, and that's about it. There's a couple books that claim to be histories of civics, but they're really histories of public education. They don't really separate out the definition of civics I just gave you from education in general. So all you get is a definition of education and a history of how schools formed over time. But this question of how does this idea of a specialized body of knowledge focusing on voting, law-abiding behaviors, where does that idea come from? So that's what I've been spending all of my time since the holidays on. And it's, I gotta say, it's been surprising every turn, because every time I pick up a new book or find a new source, I push the timeline further and further back of when this begins. Now, that one introduction to that one edited essay that talked about the history of civics, by a very reputable historian, Diane Ravitch, wrote that. She said that the very first civics book was published in 1867 by Reverend Joseph Aldine. It was called A Political Catechism. Okay. And you know, one of the great things about doing this work in 2024 is you can just Google it, and there it is. You know, the most obscure book in the world is only one copy at Harvard Library, but I got it on my computer in my basement. It's the greatest thing ever. And, you know, okay, 1867, that puts us solidly after the Civil War and the period of Reconstruction. And in fact, that's what I was thinking when I gave the Institute my title for my talk, and I thought I'd be talking about the Civil War. But, like I said, this is kind of a dynamic work in progress, and as I've been going, I've been pushing that date further and further back. I found an earlier civics book that was published in Massachusetts and Boston, which was the center of all textbook educational publishing for the first century of American history, from 1827 by a guy named William Sullivan, also called the Political Catechism. And then I pushed that back even further. I found a 1797 book called The Political Catechism by another congregational minister. And then I think I finally maybe have hit the bottom of the well. I found that the great Noah Webster is the author of the American Spelling Book, by which we all today spell words the same way. He's the innovator of what's known as the American Standard Spelling. And Noah Webster published his American Spelling Book in 1790, and in the second edition, not the first edition, but the second edition, he included a 5-page appendix called the Moral Catechism, and then a 3-page appendix to that called the Political Catechism. That's the beginning. That's the first one. Now, it's really significant that Noah Webster did this, and it's really significant that he did it only for one edition of his book and then dropped it. So the edition of the book in 1790, Noah Webster was just marketing his book for the first time. By the way, in 1790, there weren't a lot of schools. The school project had not really developed yet. There were these private academies, private schools essentially, where all the wealthy and elite people sent their children, both boys and girls, by the way. And then in New England, in New Hampshire and Connecticut and Rhode Island and Massachusetts, they had an old common school tradition, they called it, and virtually every township supported a very rudimentary elementary school for the purpose of making sure that all the children could read the Bible. So that was the extent of American education at the time. Noah Webster published his American Spelling Book as a textbook for schools, and his timing was perfect because he published this book and it immediately became popular among all educators as the common school became publicly supported and common schools began to proliferate around the country. By 1820, the American Spelling Book had sold 10 million copies. 10 million copies, can you believe it? It was the best-selling book next to the Bible by that time. Okay, but Noah Webster only included the civics appendix to his book in one edition before it became popular, and he dropped it. He didn't think it was important. And there wouldn't be, and this guy who published the one in 1797, he just copyright pirated the earlier one from Webster, and he only had one edition too, so no one was interested in it, so he failed. Okay, so what this tells me is that there was no appetite for this idea of teaching particular knowledge about the law or the Constitution to young children in the late 18th century. There was no appetite for that. In fact, there wouldn't be really until this guy William Sullivan does it in 1827. So there's a good 30-year run, a whole generation, where there's no interest in this idea of civics, or even really a full conception of what it is. Notice he called it a political catechism or a constitutional catechism, which was the same title as his moral catechism. It was all catechism, it was all religious, and indeed the general idea of education at this time is that we're supposed to teach children to be good people. It's a moral education. And we do that by having them read the Bible, and we do that by having them read little instructive stories, such as that George Washington cut down the cherry tree and so forth and so on. That was the nature of education. It was moral education. People understood that education was about making people better, changing their behavior, but they had not yet got the idea that we're going to segregate out the legal and lawful and constitutional and suffrage aspects of that into a separate curriculum. In fact, when Webster tried that, it failed and he discarded it. So it was an experiment that failed, which really proves the point that no one had an interest in it. So, here's the historical, thinking as like a historian, the historical question is, what happens to make people embrace this idea by the 1820s? What happens to make this idea by the 1820s and then into the 19th century begin to take on a life of its own that eventually takes over the educational establishment? Because by the 20th century, civics will be established as a separate curriculum of every school, part of every school day. There will be endowed chairs of civics at dozens of universities. It becomes a whole thing of itself. So what changes? What happens? Well, I can illustrate this change with the sheet of quotes that I've given you. And it's, let me skip down here to the quote on the second page by Horace Mann. Many of you have probably heard of Horace Mann. He's considered the greatest American educator. His statue is in the Hall of Statuary in Congress. He's the founder of Antioch College. Well, you know, that happened to that, but he is the founder of Antioch College. He's considered the founding father of American education. Well, Horace Mann, he was the superintendent of education of Massachusetts, and from that most important position in the world of education in the early 19th century, he was able to promote his own ideas about what education is. And most of his ideas were about the importance of schooling in general. And he merely echoed a lot of the thinking of some of the earlier founders who I have on page 1. So a lot of the early founding fathers and mothers of America had the idea that, we've set up this thing called a republic. It's based on democracy. There's no king. There's no aristocracy. The whole thing is a house of cards that depends upon people being good people. If people aren't good people in a democracy, democracy will quickly fail. It'll get corrupted. There'll be mobs. Law will be disregarded because there's no counterweight to sort of mass thinking. So you have to control the thinking of the masses. That was the original thought. So schools are very important. And I illustrate on page 1, I don't want to go too deeply into it, but a lot of the founding fathers had a very controlling idea of what education should be, especially this guy Benjamin Rush, who was, most founding fathers, when they wanted to talk to a wise guy, they talked to Benjamin Franklin. He was the wisest guy around. When Benjamin Franklin wanted advice, he went to Benjamin Rush. That's who he is. So, but you'll see that he was very controlling. But the whole idea of sort of social control was embedded in schooling from the very beginning. But that social control was a moral control. We want to control people in a sort of a Christian, general, non-sectarian, Protestant Christian sort of a way. So what happens to that? What happens to sort of discredit that moral education, which the American educational establishment was built upon? It was immigration. It was immigration. It was the influx of people to America who had different cultural, religious traditions and who were seen as alien and foreign and other by those like Noah Webster, people like Horace Mann, who saw the influxes, particularly of Catholic Irish immigrants to Boston, the very center and capital and nexus of education in America, who saw there as a tremendous threat, not only just to Boston, but to the democratic experiment of America itself. And we can see this, and I just picked out one of Horace Mann was incredibly prolific. It's really easy to pick out quotes if you want to pick and choose, but this is fairly typical. He wrote in a journal that he published, "The rapid influx of a foreign population, ignorant of our laws and hostile to our institutions, may debase our morals and overthrow our government. Law may perhaps delay and even prevent such a catastrophe, but in the education of the people, a barrier is erected against which the waves of foreign ignorance and vice may break and foam in vain." Typical 19th century flowery language. But what he's expressing there, of course, is that he's expressing both a fear of this alien, and by the way, in the 1820s, people like Horace Mann and other elite Boston people saw the Irish not only as foreign and other and part of a corrupt religion, but they also saw them as racially inferior to them, biologically, naturally, ancestrally inferior as well. And the influx and the increasing numbers of Irish Catholics, and of course they're also the working class of the city too, let's not forget that. They're generally the masses of the poor, the masses of people who are filling the newly built factories, and they are perceived as the agents of disorder, and the agents of crime, and the agents of riot. And Horace Mann and others, I don't want to pin it all on Horace Mann, but people of his ilk begin thinking, you know what? We have schools for all these Irish kids. They're all going to school because by the 1820s, Massachusetts had universal education, by the way, by the 1820s, as did most of New England, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island. But nonetheless, it didn't seem to change the behavior of the working class. The working class was rioting, it was striking. In Rhode Island, in the 1820s, the working class attempted to overthrow the state government, which can't fault them for because the state government was a leftover from the aristocratic British times. It still had a charter that had landed gentry, for example, and voting by blood. So, they had good reasons to overthrow it. But, and there were riots in the streets of Boston. The moral education seemed not to be working. So they need something additional. They need something more specific, something more focused on the behaviors that they want to control. What behaviors do they want to control? Well, of course, they want to stop the rioting. They want to stop the striking, because strikes actually are a theft of private property and an insult to the American tradition of private property. Just read John Locke. So strikes have to go, unions have to go, and Catholicism, well, we'd like to get that out of here too, but we can't really root it out. It's too well established, so we'll just kind of ignore that for a while. But what if we change their voting behavior? Because one of the things they really focus upon is that the Irish vote, and they vote in tremendous proportions. 80–90% of eligible individuals in the 1820s and 1830s voted. And if the poorer you were, the more likely you were to vote. Kind of the opposite of where we are today. And a lot of the reason for that was because people understood the power of ethnic, racial, class solidarity. Irish immigrants understood. I might not be able to read the law, but I'm able to figure out which of these two guys is going to represent me. The guy with a name like mine. The guy who I see at church, right? Now, here's the thing about early civics education. There's a claim that it's about encouraging people to be more civically active. There's a claim that it's about getting people to do things like vote, to be politically active, but this is actually incorrect. This is actually bordering on a lie. Because the guilty little secret at the very base of civics is that the individuals who are conceiving of civics as a separate curriculum, as a separate course of study, as a separate field, they have the idea that there's a right way and a wrong way to vote. The right way to vote is to look at policy documents and to carefully scrutinize the law and to look past things like your community solidarity or your religious solidarity or your ethnic solidarity or your language solidarity. Those things are invalid reasons to vote. The only good reason to vote is because you have intellectually chosen a policy position which your candidate agrees with, and that policy position also cannot align with your own self-interest necessarily. This is the ideal of voting. So what's happening through civics education is twofold. One, there's the element of social control. We're going to try and control these benighted masses who vote the wrong way by teaching them, making them smarter voters, and teaching them that voting just because someone speaks Gaelic or is Catholic, that's corrupt. We're going to call that corruption. That's wrong. You can't do that. That's one thing they're going to do. But the other thing they're doing is that they're invalidating that behavior entirely. They're essentially defining any sort of ethnic, racial, class solidarity as outside the realm of proper democracy, by definition. Now, let's get to William Sullivan's first textbook on civics, which arrives in 1827, just as the Irish are beginning to become numerous in Boston, just as the first textile factories are being built in the outskirts of Boston and up into the river valleys of New England. And it's at this moment William Sullivan writes his textbook on civics. And this is where it's important to know who William Sullivan actually is in some more detail. He was one of the richest men in America, both by his own ancestry. His father and his grandfather were both governors of various states in New England. And by marriage, he married into the family of a man who at one time was the foreign agent for America to France and was the middleman for all of the loans that went back and forth from America to France. In fact, he was such a good negotiator that if you read the act creating the Louisiana Purchase, there's a separate clause just for him, giving him a little margin of that $20 million for Louisiana. He got a piece of it. This is the richest family. In fact, when they built the new governor's mansion in Boston, this family bought a parcel twice as large as the governor's mansion directly across the street and built a bigger house. That's who William Sullivan's family was. William Sullivan was also for a time a legislator in the Massachusetts Assembly when the Assembly was drafting the new Massachusetts Constitution. And the new Massachusetts Constitution of, I think it's 1822, They debated such things as universal white male suffrage or just universal suffrage. They actually chose universal suffrage. They eliminated the racial component that had been there before. But Sullivan voted against dropping any of the restrictions on voting. He also took a firm stand and was successful in keeping voting for the Senate based upon land ownership. So when they gerrymandered the Senate map, it was all based upon taxables, which was basically property. So the rich got more senators than the poor did. This was William Sullivan's doing. So this is his ideal. This is his ideal of America, where the elites get more say in things, and the working class get his civics book. And his civics book is it's fascinating to read. I have a whole section about it. It's I don't know. I mean, it's basically a club in book form. It's just beating the child over the head about how to vote and how to do this and how to do that. That's the origin, the very deep origin of civics, and I apologize if I sold wrong because it's not in the post-Civil War period. But we do get there. Because we get there because this idea is sort of unleashed on the world in the 1820s and 1830s. And there's a step that we have to recognize before we get there. One other thing that people like William Sullivan and Horace Mann and other educators do is that and one of the consequences of their definition of what civics is, and especially the definition that invalidates most of the way that people vote, they support a new idea about how to restrict people's voting. Now, in the past, of course, people had been restricted to voting all sorts of ways. Most famously, of course, women couldn't vote, right? Obviously, until the 20th century. So sex was a basis of voting restriction. Most states, until the 15th Amendment, had racial restrictions on voting. There was also property restrictions, which were becoming more rare by the 1820s, but had not entirely been discarded, such as William Sullivan's own Constitution still had certain elements of property. But these educators and the logic of their civics morphed into a new public policy that had never been proposed before, never in the history of the world. The policy was, let's give people a test to see if they're literate before they vote. So we will just wipe out all the illiterates. If you want to vote, you got to read my civics book, and you got to know how to read, right? So I mean, the club of hitting people over the head with civics only works if they're literate. So Massachusetts, actually it's New Hampshire is first. New Hampshire passes a literacy test for voting in 1854. Massachusetts follows suit in 1857. These are the first two literacy tests in American history. It's not Mississippi, it's not Alabama, it's not Louisiana, it's New Hampshire and Massachusetts. The two most over-schooled states in the nation at this time. And there's a direct correlation there. That's not an accident. In other words, it's the Yankee educators who invent the idea of the literacy test, which by the end of the 19th century will be the primary way that the masses of newly emancipated Americans are kept from the polls. And moreover than that, when those literacy tests come into being, first in Louisiana, and then in Mississippi, and then in Alabama, and then in every former Confederate state, there's not a nary of protest from the North. There's no pushback in Congress. You won't find any journals of opinion writing essays about those terrible white Southerners restricting the civil rights of our American neighbors and friends. No, none of that. There's utter silence. Why is there utter silence from the North? The North that had fought, supposedly, for emancipation and for equality? Partly it's because by the end of the 19th century, these ideas have won. And most people have a clear idea now that voting and democracy isn't really just making a choice, it has to be the right choice. And the right choice is an educated choice, a choice that isn't based upon race, ethnicity, class. Those are now considered unacceptable. So we'll just cut those out. We'll just cut those out through literacy tests. Now the path to get there is part of this work that I'm just beginning to scratch, to tell you the truth. To be perfectly honest, it's going to be kind of the later chapters of the book that I'm sketching out. It's the development of institutions and associations that back these ideas. You see, in the early years, there's certain educators like Horace Mann who push these ideas as individuals. But after the Civil War, what happens is that philanthropists begin to endow institutes, charitable organizations with lots of money to push these ideas. We get the development of new associations dedicated to spreading these ideas. And then we get academia, especially because now there's these big pots of philanthropy money. And I've never seen anybody run away from a grant proposal. There's these big pots of philanthropy money now behind this, and academia just marches in line. So the most important organization, there's two organizations I'll talk about briefly. I don't want to keep you too long. So one organization is famous, and one organization I think I discovered. So one organization is the Peabody Fund for Education, which anybody who deals in educational history will know something about. The Peabody Fund was established by George Peabody immediately after the Civil War to advance education in the South. And George Peabody, who's not a household name anymore, I can explain how wealthy he was by just saying who his successor was. The person who was his partner who took over his business when he died. His partner who took his junior partner who took over his business was named John Pierpont Morgan. That was his junior partner. So George Peabody was one of the wealthiest men, not only in America, but probably in the world. And he gave several $1 million in 1866 for the project of building schools in the South. And for this fund, because George Peabody was getting up in years by this time, I think he was 80 by this time, and he was convalescing, he was living in London, so he set up a board of trustees to manage this Peabody Fund, and the board of trustees was, it was a who's who of everybody at that time. I mean, Ulysses S. Grant, 3 future presidents, 2 members of the Supreme Court. I mean, it's just the blue ribbon board of trustees. And they hire an administrator to go around the South and figure out how they can best apply this money. And the person comes back and says, you know what? We'll never be successful building schools in the South unless we get local buy-in. We have to get local people on the ground to do this work. Otherwise, it'll never happen. And like, great idea. We love that idea. Let's go with that. Who are the local people on the ground? It's all the old Confederates. It's all the old Confederate officers and office holders, and not any newly emancipated communities are really involved. And as a result, the Peabody Fund, very early on in its work, requires, for the purposes of getting its money, and it has more money than the federal government, schools have to be segregated. School segregation comes from the north to the south. And likewise, there were a couple of bills in Congress. One that fails, called the Blair Educational Bill, which would have funded schools in the South as well. It fails, but there's some minor ones that also passed. Congress as well ties federal funding for schools to segregation. So this is and if you read the minutes of the trustees and the reports, it just drips with this idea of civic responsibility and this idea that the purpose of education is to make better citizens. They haven't yet segregated out into a different curriculum, but you can see this idea of civics implying a right way and a wrong way to vote as being a force disenfranchising African Americans in the South. The other organization is something called the American Institute for Civics. That's the one I discovered. The American Institute for Civics, it was organized in 1885, immediately after a national convention of the National Educational Association, still around today, the NEA. They had their big convention, 6,000 members at this convention in summer 1884. And the keynote speaker, whenever the NEA meets, it's a 6-day convention back then. Partly because, to get there, you have to take trains, it takes a couple of days to get there, a couple of days back. Anyway, 6-day convention. It's always the first day opening speaker is like the lit up and marquee superstar speaker. And in 1884, that superstar speaker was the general manager of the Peabody Fund. And he gives a speech about citizenship and about the importance of teaching citizenship as a separate subject, which the NEA had never considered before. If you looked at their journals, no one had ever, you can't find the word civics. They don't have the word civics yet. It's coined the next year. He doesn't use the word civics, he uses the word citizenship education. And he urges the importance of citizenship education to all these educators. And they fall down in like rhapsodic, apoplexy. It's like, this is such a great idea. And several of the people who were in attendance at that time immediately form a new association to take these ideas forward. And that was the American Institute for Civics. They invented the word civics for the association's name. So we know the guy who invented the word civics. His name is Henry Waite, W-A-I-T-E. And Henry Waite is an interesting character because he had written several important and influential editorials against federal funding for schools in the South, largely on the argument that it was a waste of money because you can't educate black folks anyway. This is the first organization dedicated to civics, and the idea is incredibly popular. They get all the people who were on the Peabody board immediately join the AIC board, so you get all those people. Mm-hmm. And then they get an even more august person to be their formal president, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Morrison Waite, from Toledo. Morrison Waite is their president, and he serves as president of the civics organization at the very same time that he's using his position as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to strike down all the Reconstruction laws and to weaken emancipation and to weaken the 14th Amendment. This is what Morrison Waite does. He's the president of this organization. So you see how it all combines, these ideas and the influential individuals, and then these powerful associations, and the AIC becomes a powerful organization because immediately scholars begin to just run with this idea of civics. By 1890, the AIC had something like 290 lecturers who would travel around the country extolling these ideas, and every single one of them was a tenured professor at a university. The presidents of at least a dozen universities served on the board of directors. It immediately found itself completely embedded in academia, almost immediately. And they published a whole series of journals, which are so obscure that most of the copies are lost now. But they published one called Citizenship, they called one called Civics, various iterations of all those. I found about half of them, but no one even thought to collect them. So they're all gone. The papers at AIC are gone too, because eventually this guy Henry Waite, who founded it, apparently ran into some financial problems with New York real estate. He's accused of embezzlement, and apparently he dumped the papers of the organization at some point when he was hiding his evidence for his prosecution. So we don't have any records of the AIC except for these scattered journals that we found and some newspaper reports of their activities. That's about all we got. I was really disappointed when I checked out, talked to a Library of Congress archivist, and they said, yeah, we got some AIC stuff. I said, oh, really? Yeah, we got 3 pages. Great, it's great. It saved me a trip to DC. So that's as far as I've gotten now. It's clearly, you know, I've pulled the thread on the sweater. The sweater's come apart. I know there's more to be pulled. I haven't pulled it all. I haven't left the 19th century really, but I think where the story goes up to the present time, of course, is the further institutionalization of this idea of civics, which we can see even today. I mean, and I call it the civics industrial complex. You know, by today, it's a multi-billion-dollar-a-year industry pushing this idea. It's funded by both the government and our largest philanthropic institutions. It's funded by the Rockefeller, Morgan, you know, all of them. And every university, pretty much every university, has some institute dedicated to civics. Now, I'm not saying all that's bad. I'm not raining on the whole parade, but I want everyone to be clear about where that comes from and what the tradition is that produced it. And it is produced that I think today, to a certain extent, it kind of cycles through the same arguments in a much more sort of liberally whitewashed way. But the arguments are still fundamentally the same. We've changed the language. You know, instead of talking about being law-abiding, we talk about social engagement. You know, instead of talking about, you know, being a correct and proper voter, you know, we talk about, you know, being community spirited. Or, you know, instead of having a course on proper voting, we have a course on service learning. You know, we've changed a lot of these designations, but their genealogy is pretty darn clear. That's where it comes from. So I think I've run to the end of my research as of today. If you're interested, you know, email me in a couple weeks. I'll have more for you. And I also have to say that I'm very pleased because the open educational project of the BGSU Library and the Ohio Department of Higher Ed funded my grant proposal for my civics book. So, ironically, the state of Ohio will be funding my civics book, and it will be coming out about this time next year, just in time, sadly, probably for it to catch up with the legislation that'll pass by that time, mandating that every student has to study civics. And it'll be in an open doc format, so it'll be available to all educators for free. So, thank you very much. If you have any questions,
We do have time for questions.